So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
When Donald Trump was sworn into office this past Monday, there were indications he might hold off for a little while at least on his promise to impose 25% tariffs on all goods coming into the U.S. from Canada. But then that night, as the president signed nearly 200 executive orders, he said the tariffs will be put in place next week on February 1st.
We're thinking in terms of 25% on Mexico and Canada because they're allowing vast numbers of people. Canada's a very bad abuser also. Vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in.
When do you think you would enact those?
I think February 1st.
Are you planning on giving notice of that?
I think we'll do it February 1st.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said this week that Canada is promising to retaliate immediately.
Because there's no sugarcoating it. The incoming administration's proposed tariffs against Canada would harm Americans. They would put American jobs at risk. They would put our collective security at risk. They would raise costs at a time when people simply deserve a break. And perhaps, most crucially, they're not necessary. Our trading relationship is the envy of the world, and the better path forward is to make it stronger.
And Garry Douglas with the North Country Chamber of Commerce is with us. Welcome back. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Seems like we just did this a year ago.
Exactly. On Inauguration Day, at first, it looked as if the president might hold off on his threat to impose tariffs on Canada, but that optimism was short-lived. And it looks as if it could start within the next few days, the first day of February.
Well, one thing about President Trump's style, which we know from his first term, and we're seeing it again, he likes to keep everybody a little off foot. So even when you think you know what the answer is, he'll switch it up or add something to it a little while later, and that's what we're dealing with, is that uncertainty. But we are just several days away from a potential trade war. That's the term that has to be used between the U.S. and Canada, which, given that the North Country's single biggest driving force in its economy is their interaction with Canada, will be very impactful here, let alone the country. It could knock more than 1% off GDP nationally in the U.S. and up to 3% in Canada, pushing them into a recession. But here locally, we're even more intertwined because of just how integrated we are, from manufacturing to cross-border tourism to trade and warehousing and distribution and energy. It all is interrelated with Canada and will cost us dearly.
The president's talking about 25% on everything coming in
from
Canada across the board. You just touched on it a little. What impact, first of all, could that have on Canada, our biggest trading partner here in the North Country?
Well, in Canada, it's widely estimated again that it would knock 3% off their GDP and push the country into recession. So it would be a very broad, very deep, very sudden impact. We are far and away their biggest customer. They are far and away our biggest customer, which makes the stakes here and the numbers absolutely immense, with ripple effects right down the line. I mean, if you push Canada into a recession, we have to assume that cross-border visitation and shopping will diminish, simply because of the attitude of consumers going into a recession, let alone maybe I don't want to buy things in America, I'm not going to go down there, I'm unhappy with the way they're being treated. Even if you wash that out, just the fact that the consumers would feel they have less money, there's just a ripple effect that goes through everything.
And obviously there are the businesses here in the North Country that are part of the supply chain going back and forth with Quebec, Canadian companies based here in the North Country, and a number of companies doing business with them. What do you think would be the economic impact on the North Country?
Well, we're aggressively reaching out to all of our manufacturers, warehouses, and others who may have an impact now one-on-one to get an assessment. We've promised we won't cite any of them by company name, but we're getting a good sense of what the impacts are. We are a manufacturing community here in the Plattsburgh area. We're a blue-collar manufacturing community that makes things. The reason why this little rural hub in the northeastern corner of New York is able to be this vibrant and diverse manufacturing sector is because of our connection with Quebec. Let's not kid ourselves. It's because the cross-border investment by Quebec companies is convenient in terms of logistics, in terms of maintaining certain supply chain connections, raw material connections with their U.S. operations, linked with their Quebec operations. This kind of puts a whack on that. So there are a lot of our companies are dependent for raw materials in several cases, One of the major, I don't want to reveal the company, one of the major manufacturers in the entire North Country is dependent on their raw materials almost 100% from Canada, and they have no place to stockpile. Now, some of our companies have been stockpiling. Our customs brokers have indicated they've had 2 of the busiest months they've had in history over the last couple of months because of that phenomenon, but it's short-lived. They're anticipating, but you can only stockpile so much. You only got so much room, so much capacity, and even if you max that out, you're maybe getting ahead of the curve by weeks, not by months, and certainly not by years. So the impact will come. You're stalling it or hoping that it'll go away before you run out of your stockpiled materials. But some can't stockpile. They don't have the space. In some cases, including one major company that was surprising, they don't have the finances to stockpile the expensive materials and components that they use. So the impacts will be immediate. In one case, the company is talking about having no ability to pass that cost on, a loss of raw material. They predict layoffs because they're not going to be able to sustain their operation without the supply of raw materials. We have a couple of others who might be in that place as well. The other thing with our transportation equipment companies to realize is the type of business they're in. If you're making toilet paper or widgets for the consumer market, the cost goes on to the consumer, it gets passed along. By the way, it's Americans that pay the tariffs, not the company that's selling, not the country that it's coming from. It's the country that it's going to, which is, I think, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding in some Washington circles about who pays tariffs. It's like a sales tax is really what it is, so it's the buyer that pays it. But in our transportation equipment companies, for example, they're on very fixed contracts that they're producing for. It's not a product in the consumer market that you can increase the cost of. They can't pass the cost along. They're on contracts for the next several years for things like transportation equipment or rail cars. They're just going to have to absorb that cost, which means losing money in their U.S. operations, which is not good for investment. We found 2 of our manufacturers are anticipating very strong years this year with new demand. And we're tentatively planning on expansions of their operations here and new jobs. They've already put that on hold. There's too much now uncertainty about things that are related to their supply chains to commit to bringing in that new equipment or putting in that new line of production that they were going to put here. So there's all of that. By the way, add warehousing and distribution. If Canadian companies, the customers aren't going to buy their goods because they're 25% more, there's not going to be that activity of that we have here of Canadian products coming in to warehouses in Champlain to them being distributed. So there'll be an effect there. But there are a lot of little effects directly on our market because of our proximity to the border. 100% of our natural gas comes from Canada. You're going to increase the cost of natural gas consumers by 25% because of an across-the-board tariff. Direct impact there on business and on homeowners heating their homes this winter. A lot of our heating oil, people don't realize, comes out of the Port of Montreal. Many of us have maybe noticed the local heating oil suppliers with their tank trucks going up out of Route 15. They're going up and getting the oil from the Port of Montreal and bringing it down. There's another impact. But more than $1 billion of our electricity comes from Hydro-Quebec to the state of New York that goes into the grid and into the cost of our electric. We're going to increase electric bills for everybody in the state as well as here in the North Country. And then, as I noted, the potential knock-on effect on cross-border tourism and shopping, but also construction. Here's something most people don't know. 100%, not 99%, 100% of cement and asphalt in northern New York, well down into the state of New York, comes out of Quebec. Are we going to increase the costs by 25% of paving by municipalities this year, for example, because you're putting a 25% levy on asphalt coming into the country? People can't think that this is something abstract. Oh, it kind of affects the country on a macro level, but it doesn't affect my day-to-day life. It'll start affecting North Country day-to-day life very immediately.
You talked about the electricity. Are there fears that it could impact the Champlain-Hudson Power Express, or is that still in the early enough stages where the cable's being laid that the hope is that wouldn't be affected by?
Well, it would be affected if this were a prolonged tariff that did include electricity, which would be madness, by the way. So we have to hope that if they do go ahead on February 1st and apply some tariffs, they do like they did in 2017 and target some things, which obviously, if it would be smart, you wouldn't target those energy sectors because it's such an a direct return on voters and consumers. But theoretically, if it was 25% across the board, of course it would affect that. That's what's been priced in for the end customers in New York and the grid is a price that wouldn't be sustainable if you had 25% tariff on that.
Is the hope that this is a negotiating ploy on
Yes.
the part of the president, that he would like to sit down and reevaluate the North American Free Trade Agreement, the USMCA as it's called now, that he's unhappy over the trade deficit with Canada, that he wants to renegotiate the trade deal, and that this is the first step to get everyone's attention, the threat of tariffs?
Yes, I mean, the hope is, as we saw in the first term, that it is a negotiating stance. And that's why we're not quite as shocked as we were the first time. Nothing like it had ever happened before. Now we kind of expected this rough and ready negotiating style and kind of cooked it into the psychology, which doesn't make the stakes any less severe, but makes the shock factor a little less because we've kind of been there before. Many of us, including myself, in an extensive meeting on Friday with Minister Ng, the Canadian Trade Minister, and talking about strategy, pointed out was we're really got three buckets in play at one time, and he wants to accelerate the relook at USMCA, which is due to happen in 2026. He wants to start it now, so that's part of it, and that's what happened the first time. Oh, NAFTA is the worst trade agreement in history. We got to renegotiate it. We renegotiated it. We ended up very well. We actually expanded U.S.-Canadian trade and preserved and locked in most of the things that were in play once we got to the table. But also the other two buckets are, and the one that's most immediate that the president has referenced is border security. And it has gotten worse on the north. It's still not anywhere near the number of migrants on the Canadian border, but it has become serious. And also on the fentanyl side, it's become quite serious. And I can remember a few years ago there was one Canadian politician in particular who I won't name, who said in concern about the northern border and complaints about it, well, it's not our job to oversee people leaving the country. Well, it is now. And Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada did over $1 billion in commitments to beef up their kind of outbound security on the border. I think the president is saying, as you would expect style-wise for him to say, is, I'm not convinced we've wringed everything out of you yet. I want to see more. And so I think there's consideration being given to what more can be done. And even the provinces, Ontario and Quebec, have committed more police resources and more provincial activity to try to help at the border. And then there's defense. Canada is, you can't argue otherwise, is one of the failures in terms of the NATO countries meeting their commitment to 1% spending or 2% spending on defense, which President Trump is now talking ought to go up to as much as 5%. But let's just look at 2%. They're nowhere near there, and they're not getting there very quickly. So that is out there too. As if they could do more here, they could do more here to get that deadline off our backs and get to a rational conversation. So more pledges on border security, and maybe even, which I don't think will come till a potential new government in Canada, an acceleration of investment in defense. Then we might work our way through this and end up being okay. But that doesn't mean there isn't damage in the interim. These things have effects. They have damages.
And we saw in 2017 the tariffs put in place. There were retaliatory tariffs put in place by Canada, lasted a few months, and then there were
and they will
discussions.
retaliate. And I said to the minister, I said, I think we all need in the U.S., your friends certainly here in the U.S. understand politically, you can't have tariffs applied against Canada and not expect Canada to apply them in reverse. So they've already drawn up the list of things they will initially do with then ability to ratchet that up. They're going to target things that are most painful, things that Canada exports to the U.S. that will cause the most immediate pain. And you would expect them to do that, and they have to do that. It's actually in our interest that they do that to kind of get things back to an even keel sooner rather than later.